lock the heavy oak doors, draw the blades, and slit the bastard's throat while he's busy looking at the fat girl. The Russian words hung in the thick cigar smoke, intended only for the assassins. I didn't flinch. I just looked Damien Croft straight in the eye and translated the kill order mid-sentence. The steel-toed combat boot was aimed squarely at the deaf kitchen boy's jaw, but it caught my ribs instead. I hit the wet asphalt of the alleyway with a heavy, ungraceful thud, the impact forcing all the air from my lungs in a violent rush. My cheap size 20 navy trench coat tore along the shoulder seam, the brittle fabric giving way under the brutal scrape of brick and gravel. Above me, the freezing November rain of Chicago fell in sheets, washing the grime of the service entrance directly into the fresh scrape on my cheek. "Run, Toby," I wheezed, pushing my substantial weight upward, just enough to form a physical barricade between the terrified teenager and the towering Russian enforcer standing over us. Toby didn't need to hear the words. He read my lips, scrambled backward through the puddles, and disappeared through the rusted service door of the velvet room. The enforcer, a mountain of muscle wearing a cheap leather jacket, laughed. He spat a stream of Russian curses onto the pavement, specifically calling me a beached whale who had ruined his fun, before turning and marching back toward the front of the restaurant. I stayed on the ground for a long moment, my hands trembling violently against the freezing blacktop. Every breath was a sharp, jagged spike of pain in my right side. I had a $400 translation gig waiting inside, money that was supposed to keep my heat on for the next 2 months, and I was currently kneeling in garbage water, bleeding. I gripped the edge of a dumpster and hauled myself up. As I brushed the wet gravel from my ruined skirt, the faint hum of a massive engine caught my attention. Parked 30 feet away in the deepest shadows of the alley was a blacked-out Lincoln Navigator. The rear passenger window was rolled down exactly 2 inches. From the darkness of the cabin, a pair of pale, glacial blue eyes was locked onto me. Damien Croft, the most feared man in the Midwest Syndicate. He had sat in the warmth of his armored fortress and watched a heavy-set, struggling woman take a boot to the ribs for a kitchen boy she barely knew. I didn't break eye contact. I just pressed my hand against my throbbing side, straightened my torn coat, and limped toward the restaurant's side entrance. I had a job to do. The private dining room on the 3rd floor of the Velvet Room was suffocatingly warm and smelled of expensive bourbon and old blood. When I pushed through the heavy mahogany doors, the tension in the room was already thick enough to choke on. "You've got to be kidding me," a voice sneered from the corner. Sullivan, Dayan's second-in-command, was leaning against the private bar. He was a sharp, cruel-looking man whose expensive tailored suit seemed completely at odds with the street thug sneer on his face. His eyes raked over my wet, disheveled hair, the torn shoulder of my coat, and the wide, heavy curve of my hips pressing against my soaked skirt. "This is the interpreter," Sullivan barked, turning to the shadows at the head of the table. "Look at her, boss. She's dripping puddle water on the Persian rug. She looks like she ate the last 3 interpreters. I told you we should have used my guy." "Your guy is dead, Sullivan," Damien Croft said. The voice was low, devoid of any measurable emotion, but it instantly sucked the oxygen out of the room. Damien stepped out of the shadows and took his seat at the head of the massive table. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than my entire life's earnings, but there was nothing soft about him. He moved like a predator forced into a cage. His glacial eyes flicked to me. He didn't look at my weight. He didn't look at my ruined clothes. He looked specifically at my ribs, right where the boot had connected. "Sit down, Miss Lawson," Damien commanded softly. "Drink some water. You are breathing too fast." I sank into the heavy leather chair to his right, my hands shaking as I poured a glass from the crystal pitcher. Before I could take a sip, the double doors at the far end of the room swung open. Viktor Antonov had arrived. The rival Bratva boss walked in with the unearned arrogance of a man who believed he owned the world. He was flanked by 4 massive enforcers, including the man who had kicked me in the alley. Viktor took his seat opposite Damien, completely ignoring my presence, and slammed a silver pocket watch onto the table. "3 minutes, Croft," Viktor said in thick, heavily accented English. "Then I go back to my vodka. The docks are mine." "The docks belong to the city," Damien replied, his voice a dangerous murmur. "I just tax the water. Now tell me why 2 of my shipment containers were diverted to your warehouses in Southside, or we can skip the diplomacy entirely." Victor smiled a terrible, gold-toothed smile. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and switched entirely to Russian. "Translate," Damien ordered me, without looking away from Victor. I swallowed hard, pushing through the agonizing pain in my ribs. He says the shipments were a misunderstanding, a clerical error by his dock workers." Victor spoke again, his eyes sliding sideways to look at me. He looked at my wet, torn coat, the mud on my collar, and the heavy set of my thighs spreading across the leather chair. A cruel, mocking laugh rumbled in his chest. His men chuckled behind him. "He says," I continued, my voice tightening, "that perhaps you should spend less time worrying about shipping containers and more time feeding your interpreter. He says a fat cow like me will slow you down when the shooting starts." Sullivan snickered loudly from the bar. Damien didn't move a single muscle, but his left hand slowly flattened against the polished mahogany table. "Tell him," Damien whispered, "that my interpreter is worth 10 of his men, and tell him I want my cargo back by midnight." I translated the demand. Victor's smile vanished. His face hardened into a mask of pure violence. He leaned forward, drumming his fingers against the table, and began speaking rapidly in Russian. The cadence was entirely different now. It wasn't business, it was tactical. "He says your cargo is already gone," I translated, my heart hammering against my sternum as my brain rapidly processed the Bratva street slang Victor was utilizing. "He says the Midwest Syndicate is a dying animal, and he is just putting it out of its misery." Victor kept speaking, his voice dropping to a casual conversational hum as he looked at Damien. He casually adjusted his cuffs, entirely relaxed. But the words leaving his mouth were a death sentence. I didn't stop my translation. I kept my voice completely deadpan, matching Victor's casual tone, staring blankly at the crystal water glass in front of me. He also just told his men to lock the heavy oak doors. I translated smoothly, mid-sentence. "Draw their blades and slit your throat while you're busy looking at the fat girl." The room shattered. Before the final syllable even left my lips, Damien Croft exploded from his chair. The sheer violence of his movement was terrifying. He didn't draw a gun. He reached across the table, grabbed the edge of the massive 500-pound mahogany slab, and flipped the entire thing upward with an aggressive roar. "Down!" Damien roared, his hand catching the collar of my torn coat and yanking me brutally to the floor. just as the deafening crack of suppressed gunfire erupted. The heavy table acted as a splintering wooden shield. Bullets tore through the mahogany, sending razor-sharp shards of wood raining down on my head. I curled into a tight ball, my hands covering my ears, gasping as the air filled with the suffocating scent of cordite and pulverized drywall. Damien was a phantom of violence above me. He had a custom Glock 19 in his hand, firing with mechanical, terrifying precision. Two of Victor's men dropped before they even cleared their holsters, their bodies hitting the floor with heavy thuds. Sullivan was shouting from the corner, returning fire blindly, but the room was completely bottlenecked. "Move!" Damien barked, hauling me up by my bicep. His grip was absolute iron. He didn't treat me like a fragile piece of glass, and he didn't drag me like a burden. He shoved me forcefully toward the heavy service doors leading to the kitchen, using his own broad body to block the line of sight from Victor's remaining men. We burst through the swinging doors into the blinding fluorescent light of the restaurant's main kitchen. The massive iron gates of the Croft estate loomed out of the darkness, like the entrance to a fortress resort deep in the wooded hills outside the city limits. The mansion was entirely isolated from the chaos we had just left behind in the city. The moment the armored Lincoln slammed to a halt beneath the stone portico, the reality of Damien's condition became terrifyingly obvious. He didn't wait for his driver to open the door. He shoved it open himself, stepping out into the freezing rain. But his knees immediately buckled. "Boss!" Sullivan shouted, scrambling out of the front seat. I didn't wait for an invitation. I threw myself out of the SUV and caught Damien's uninjured side, wedging my heavy shoulder directly under his armpit to keep him upright. He let out a harsh, guttural hiss of pain, his massive weight leaning heavily against my curves. But he didn't push me away. Together, we dragged him up the marble steps and into the cavernous foyer of the estate. "Get him to the study," Sullivan barked, his voice laced with manic panic. He was pacing wildly, his hands pulling at his own hair. "The dock is an hour out. Victor had men blocking the tollway. It's a disaster. It's a complete goddamn disaster." We eased Damien onto a massive leather Chesterfield sofa in the center of the dark, wood-paneled room. The moment his back hit the cushions, his head lolled to the side. His skin was turning the color of wet ash. "He's going into shock," I said, my voice suddenly sharp. "Shut up," Sullivan snapped, rounding on me, his face twisted with venom. He pointed a shaking finger at my chest. "This is your fault. You tipped them off. How the hell did a fat gig economy translator know high-level Bratva kill codes, huh? You're a plant. You set us up." I ignored him. I dropped to my knees on the expensive Persian rug, my ripped coat pooling around me, and reached for Damien's ruined suit jacket. The bullet had entered just below the collarbone, tearing through the deep fascia. Blood was pulsing out in a steady, terrifying rhythm. Bright red. Arterial. "Sullivan," I said, my voice dropping the panicked civilian tremor. It became cold, flat, and absolute. "Shut your mouth, take off your belt, and hand it to me right now." Sullivan froze, blinking in pure confusion at the sudden authority radiating from me. "What? He has a severed subclavian artery. If I don't pack this wound and clamp it in the next 4 minutes, your boss is going to bleed to death on this couch. Belt. Now." Sullivan hesitated, his eyes darting to Damien, then mechanically unbuckled his leather belt and handed it over. I didn't think about the fact that I was touching the head of the Midwest Syndicate. I didn't think about the fact that I had lost my medical license 3 years ago, taking the fall for a brother who stole painkillers from my trauma ward to feed a habit that eventually killed him anyway. The panic vanished. The muscle memory of 100 gunshot wounds in the underground cartel triage clinics took over. "Hold his arm down," I ordered Sullivan. I ripped Damien's shirt open entirely, exposing the heavily scarred musculature of his chest. I grabbed a fistful of the expensive silk lining from my torn trench coat, ripped it free, and began packing the wound with brutal, unhesitating force. Damien's back arched off the sofa in pure agony, a raw scream tearing through his gritted teeth. But I didn't stop pressing. "Hold him!" I yelled, my blood-slicked hands slipping as I threaded the belt under his armpit, creating a makeshift tourniquet high on the shoulder joint to cut off the arterial flow. I pulled the leather tight, locking it into place. The bright red spurting slowed, then stopped, leaving only a slow, sluggish ooze. I stayed kneeling there, my entire upper body weight pressing down on the pressure point, breathing heavily. The room fell completely silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Damien's head rolled back toward center. His glacial blue eyes cracked open, clouded with pain, but sharply focused. He looked at my hands, buried deep in his blood, and then looked up into my face. "You're not an interpreter, Ruby," he breathed, his voice a gravelly whisper. "I translate Russian at $20 an hour, Mr. Croft," I said quietly, refusing to break eye contact. "A civilian would have fainted," Damien murmured, his gaze dropping to my wrists. "A civilian wouldn't know how to locate the subclavian artery by touch, and a civilian wouldn't have hands that steady." He reached up with his uninjured arm. I expected him to grab my wrist, to threaten me for answers. Instead, his long fingers gently brushed a piece of blood-soaked hair out of my eyes. As his hand moved, the cuff of his shirt slid back, revealing his skin. My breath hitched. The entirety of his left forearm and the back of his hand was covered in thick, silver burn scars. Deep, jagged tissue damage that spoke of unimaginable heat. Damien saw me looking. He didn't pull away or hide the disfigurement. "I couldn't get the door open," Damien said softly, a sudden, devastating vulnerability bleeding through his cold exterior. The words weren't meant for Sullivan. They were only for me. I was 12. My little brother was asleep in the back room. The fire took the whole house in 3 minutes. I tore my hands apart on the deadbolt, trying to get him out. I failed. I stared at the most dangerous man in the city, seeing the broken boy underneath. The wound he carried was exactly like mine, the crushing, suffocating guilt of a sibling you couldn't save. It was why he had sat in the Lincoln and watched me throw myself over a deaf kitchen boy in an alley. He couldn't look away from someone doing what he had failed to do. "You saved the boy tonight," Damien whispered, his eyes locking onto mine. "And you saved me. Who are you, Ruby?" "Someone who is very tired of bleeding," I finally answered, the absolute truth stripping away all my defenses. Damien stared at me for a long time. Then he slowly turned his head toward Sullivan, who was still standing by the door, pale and staring. "Get out, Sullivan," Damien ordered, the ice returning to his voice. "Wait for the doctor at the gate, and find out how Antonov knew we were coming." Sullivan's jaw tightened. The medical kit the doctor brought was left half open on the mahogany desk, but the doctor himself was gone, escorted out by 2 of Damien's loyal guards after securing the second round of stitches. The quiet of the study felt heavy, brittle, and entirely manufactured. I stood by the bookshelf, my bare feet sinking slightly into the deep wool of the rug, the oversized cashmere sweater swallowing my frame. Across the room, Damien sat upright at his desk, his face pale under the harsh brass light. But his eyes were sharp. He was looking at the security tablet, displaying the front gate logs. The screen flickered. The timestamp blinked in the corner, recording the exact minute the doctor's vehicle had departed. Then, right behind it, another entry flashed green. An unrecognized sedan had pulled past the perimeter sensors, parking 50 yards down the private drive. "Sullivan," Damien murmured, his voice cold enough to frost glass. Before he could finish the thought, the heavy oak doors of the study swung open without a knock. Sullivan stepped into the room. He wasn't alone. 2 of the estate's internal security guards flanked him, their hands resting uncomfortably close to their holstered sidearms. Sullivan's face wore a mask of manufactured distress, but his eyes glittered with the desperate, manic triumph of a man who thought he had finally won the board game. "Boss, we have a massive problem," Sullivan said, his voice echoing loudly in the enclosed space. He held up my torn, blood-soaked navy trench coat by the collar. "One of the guards found this near the service entrance. We checked the pockets." I didn't move. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my breathing stayed slow. I knew what was coming. Sullivan reached deep into the pocket of my coat and pulled out the small black burner phone he had planted there just 20 minutes ago. He tossed it onto Damien's desk, letting it slide across the polished wood until it hit the edge of the blotter. "A burner," Sullivan spat, shaking his head with theatrical disappointment. "Encrypted frequency straight to the Bratva. She didn't just happen to be at the restaurant tonight, Damien. She's Victor's inside pipeline. She's the one who leaked the shipping manifests, and she's the one who set you up for the hit." The 2 guards shifted their weight, their hands tightening around their grips. They looked at Damien, waiting for the order to draw. Damien didn't look at the phone. He didn't look at Sullivan. He looked straight at me. The glacial blue of his eyes was unreadable, a deep, bottomless ocean hiding lethal currents. "Is this true, Ruby?" Damien asked. The question was a low, dangerous rumble that filled the entire room. "Look at her, boss," Sullivan pressed, stepping closer to the desk, high on his own momentum. "She's a hack interpreter with a fabricated past. She doesn't belong in this world. She's a liability, and she just tried to get you killed. Order her cleaned up, or I swear to God, the rest of the syndicates will lose faith in your leadership by morning." The silence that followed was absolute. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked with deafening loudness. I looked at Damien. I saw the immense weight on his shoulders, the betrayal of a trusted second-in-command, the threat of an open war with the Bratva, and the terrible history of the scars on his hands. He was backed into a corner. "Sullivan," Damien said softly. "Yes, boss?" Sullivan smiled, his arrogance finally breaking through. "You're right about one thing," Damien continued, standing up slowly from his chair, his broad shoulders squaring despite the fresh stitches pulling at his chest. "There is a rat in this room." Sullivan's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "What are you talking about?" "The phone is right there." Her coat. The burner phone was registered to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. Damien interrupted, his voice dropping into a razor-sharp whisper that sliced through the room. The exact same shell corporation that funneled $4 million out of our secondary accounts 6 months ago. The transaction logs were routed through your personal terminal, Sullivan. Sullivan's face drained of all color in a single heartbeat. That's a lie. She planted it. She didn't touch that coat after we walked through those doors, Damien said, stepping around the desk, closing the distance between them with terrifying speed. And security camera 4, which covers the hallway vestibule outside this study, has a very clear, very high-definition recording of you slipping that exact phone into her pocket 20 minutes ago. The 2 guards flanking Sullivan instantly stepped back, their hands dropping away from their weapons as they realized the trap had flipped. Sullivan panicked. He lunged backward, his hand flying toward his jacket holster to draw his weapon, but he was far too slow. Before Sullivan's fingers even grazed his grip, Damien moved like a striking predator. He crossed the floor, grabbed Sullivan by the lapels of his expensive suit with his uninjured hand, and slammed him violently against the heavy oak bookshelves. Books rained down in a chaotic cascade. Damien pressed his forearm against Sullivan's throat, cutting off his air entirely. "You thought you could hand my city over to Antonov," Damien growled, his face inches from Sullivan's bulging eyes. "You thought because I carry scars, I've gone soft. You are done." Sullivan clawed at Damien's arm, his face turning a deep, dangerous purple, but he couldn't break the iron grip. "Take him out of my sight," Damien commanded, tossing Sullivan onto the floor like broken trash. "Lock him in the lower holding cells until the federal marshals pick him up in the morning. Let the courts handle his corporate treason." The guards hauled Sullivan up, dragging his kicking, screaming form out of the study and slamming the heavy doors shut behind them. The room grew quiet again. The adrenaline drain was instantaneous, leaving a heavy, exhausted stillness in the air. I stood motionless by the bookshelf, my hands loosely clutching the soft cashmere of Damien's sweater. I had survived the alley, the bullet, and the frame job. But as Damien turned away from the door and slowly walked back towards me, a new kind of tension settled over my skin. He stopped 2 feet away from me. The height difference forced me to tilt my head back, looking up into his face. The cold, untouchable Mafia boss was gone, replaced by a man who looked at me with raw, unfiltered honesty. "You didn't have to stay," Damien murmured, his voice rough and quiet. "You would have bled out on that couch," I replied simply. Damien reached out. His large, scarred hand hovered for a second, before gently resting against the side of my face, his thumb lightly tracing the line of my cheekbone. His touch was warm, steady, and entirely safe. "The front gates are open, Ruby," Damien said, his eyes searching mine. "The car is waiting outside. You can take your papers, take your freedom, and walk away from this dark world tonight. No one will ever come after you." I looked down at his hand, then back up into his glacial eyes. I thought about my empty apartment, the broken heater, and the endless, lonely grind of a life spent hiding in the background. Then I thought about the space I took up, and the man who finally dared to honor it. I didn't step back. I leaned my face deeper into his palm. "I've spent my whole life hiding in the margins, Damien," I whispered, a quiet, fierce smile touching my lips. "I'm done running." Damien's eyes flared with a dark, consuming heat. He pulled me against his solid, unyielding chest, wrapping his arms around my curves, and crushed his lips to mine in a deep, fierce, claiming kiss. Outside the tall study windows, the rain finally stopped, leaving the dark Chicago night dead silent. But across the iron gates, parked 50 yards down the deserted road, the headlights of an unmarked black sedan slowly flickered on, watching the house from the shadows. Did the unexpected twists and deep emotional payoff of Ruby and Damien's battle leave you breathless? This dark empire is only beginning. If this story moved you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss another intense romance. Leave a comment below. What would you have done if you were in Ruby's shoes? Stay truly thrilling.